First steps in working with museums are obviously making contact. And one of the things Will and I both want to really emphasize is that people working in heritage are even busier than we are as academics. And so these kinds of partnerships really do take time to foster. Now, you might have a contact already from your supervisor or from someone else at your institution who's done some work with heritage, and absolutely take advantage of those. But if you find yourself in the position of kind of cold calling institutions, which I've done a number of times, these are just some tips. So museum websites, if you go to them, will often have a generic contact email address, which will just be like contact Kelvin Grove at Kelvin Grove. And getting a reply to that kind of email address is very, very difficult. Sometimes they don't reply at all. And if they do, it takes a really long time. And of course, the person on the other end of that email address is not necessarily who you're trying to get in touch with. So there are a couple of ways to handle this. In the days when we can go in person to places, if you can pop in, often the person at the desk will have an idea of who you should talk to and can put you in contact with a real person rather than a generic email address. But you can also do some Googling on the website or kind of materials related to the museum to try to find out a named person. So for instance, when I was trying to get in touch with Paisley Museums, I ended up finding the right person's name through a news story in the local paper about a new exhibition that named the head of education at the museum. Her email address was obviously not in that news story, nor was it anywhere on the museum's website. So you can then take that name and kind of, again, Google around until you find a way of contacting them. For instance, they might have it listed on a LinkedIn page, or as I did with Paisley Museums, I found the relevant person on Twitter and slid into her DMs and got a reply almost instantly. It was really amazing how effective that was. I had been trying to get in touch for a couple of weeks at that point, and I had a nice response from her and an email in my inbox within 20 minutes of DMing her on Twitter. So the point of this is just that it takes time to find the right person at a museum. And you really just need to keep trying. The first person you get in touch with probably won't be the right person. They'll be, a sort of, they might be a curator, or they might be someone who does the press releases, or they might just be the person running the website, and they won't necessarily be the one you're trying to collaborate with. So just keep trying and getting more and more email addresses as you go along. Always remember that museums have their own plans and future visions. So you're going to need to be really realistic about your timeline for working with heritage. Obviously, you guys are doctoral students, so you've got a sort of set period of your research, but you really need to be looking quite far ahead to think about where you're going to fit any public engagement or knowledge exchange in. So do make contact early. It takes time to even start planning. As I just said, it takes time to even make contact. And most institutions really need quite a lot of advance notice in order to fit your plans in with their pre-existing plans. So for instance, a single day event I did with the Potteries Museum in Stoke-on-Trent, which didn't involve changing the collection at all. I wasn't, putting on an exhibition. It was just bringing some students in and using the space. Took nearly a year to coordinate from kind of first point of contact to actual event. And you want to make sure within that timeline that you're really allowing time for collaboration. You don't want to treat museums as just a venue that you can bring your ideas to. You need to think about how you can talk to each other. So let the museum influence the project just as you'll be contributing your own ideas. Another important point is that smaller museums are inevitably more open to collaboration than bigger institutions. Big museums, like for instance, the Kelvin Grove in Glasgow, have a really full calendar. Visiting and temporary exhibitions are planned very far in advance. And these museums have existing partnerships that do take priority over anything you might be planning. they're simply less reliant on academics to bring in audience or funds. And so you're not necessarily going to be a priority. Whereas local museums, small museums, which I'm a huge proponent of for a number of reasons, but from very pragmatic reasons, they might be very, very grateful for a bit of a new audience or small pots of money that academics can bring in. Keep in mind that these are the institutions that are suffering the most in the current climate, both necessary closures because of COVID, but also funding cuts that are being enacted across the country. So they are the ones who are most open to our help at the moment. As I said, do keep in mind that museums are more than just a venue. Lots and lots of academics decide that the best way to do knowledge exchange or public engagement is through an exhibition. And exhibitions can be wonderful. Will is going to talk about one he did in a little bit. But I really encourage you to think about what more the museum might have to offer than just an exhibition, than just four walls onto which you can put your research. So think about the fact that they've got vast stores of material that there isn't space for on the display floor. It might be too fragile, it might be broken, they might be duplicates, and they might be controversial in some way, which can be very exciting. So think about whether you want to access any of that material. Most institutions do have some kind of archives or records, acquisition records, the paper trail that's attached to the objects, but also correspondence, notes from past curators. That can all be really exciting material to work with from a literary perspective, a historical perspective, lots of things you can do with that. And of course, they have an incredible team who already work on education and outreach. Every museum has someone, but most likely more than one someone, who work in that field. These are people whose whole job it is to reach the public. So if you're doing public engagement, don't ignore them, make use of that resource. So think about how you might incorporate any aspects of the museum into your work. You also need to consider what you can offer to the museum. Your research, of course, is brilliant, but don't think of that as what you're bringing to the table, or at least not exclusively, because it's probably not enough to incentivize a museum to work with you. They need to get something from this partnership, just like you're getting something from the partnership. So for instance, it might be that you provide a new audience. A lot of times academics want to do an exhibition because the public seems built in and guaranteed, right? Museums already have visitors, you can address them, easy. But actually, a lot of times what museums want from us is drawing in a new audience. So for instance, as I said, I did a collaboration with the Potteries Museum in Stoke, and what they wanted from me was a new audience, an audience of young adults. So as a local museum, they get tons of visitors from the primary schools as just kind of part of the standard field trip that primary schools take. But that really peters out by the time kids hit secondary school. And of course, they get local adults visiting, but that kind of crucial young adult period, they don't get a lot of them through the door. So they were thrilled when I suggested bringing groups from local secondary schools into the museum. They also wanted me to spotlight the variety of their collection. They have a huge ceramics collection, of course, they're the Potteries Museum, but they have so much more, and they really wanted that to be emphasized. They were very grateful to have some little pots of money. So for instance, using their catering services, there are a lot of ways you can take the funding budget you have and kick little sums of money towards the museum who might be struggling. And they wanted something that would last more than the single day event. So we came up with a little game that I put together that could be played by visitors again and again coming to the museum. Also keep in mind that if you're bringing in third parties, you need to be able to offer them something as well. So as I said, my work with the museums involves school groups, and schools have their own priorities and time pressures. So you need to think about how your research can help them. Don't assume that they're grateful to have us reach out. They're busy. And, I first contacted, I think, about 10 schools in order to eventually get one that would participate in this Potteries event. So be patient and make it clear how your work suits their curriculum. So the group I ended up working with were working on interdisciplinary research projects. So my work was particularly well suited to that area of study. And this goes for any other third parties that you might want to involve, charities or community groups. Think about what you are offering to them. I said that audience is a big draw that we can offer to museums, but you also need to think about how you're going to attract them. So we all want to engage the public, but do keep in mind what kind of public goes to the museums you're interested in. I've got some statistics here, but it's a lot of what we would expect. A sort of middle class white audience, small children, and then kind of older adults tend to be the ones going to museums. And so young adults, that sort of 16 to maybe 40 age range, minority groups, working class populations, these are not sort of typically the museum going public. And so if those are the people you want to reach, you need to think about how you're going to get them through the door, which the museums will be very grateful for. So think about what you can do to attract them. Will you sort of reach out to community groups? Will you reach out to charities that work with certain groups that you want to address? Could you possibly take the museum to them? Can you borrow things from the museum and bring them into community spaces that might be a bit more accessible? So think about the ways in which you can ensure that your research is reaching the correct audience for it. All right, so that is it for my talk portion. I'm going to now switch over to a short video about my project with the potteries that lets the other participants talk for a bit, so that you have a bit more of a sense of what a variety of different disciplines could get out of this kind of thing. Labeling Museum is a project based on my wider research into the history of 19th century museums and the history of museum display and education. Museums initially left their collections largely unlabeled, assuming that people would be able to look at the object and understand it with no prompting whatsoever. This was really tactics intended to exclude people from the museum. So people without a good education couldn't really understand what they were looking at and therefore didn't come to the museum. So in the 19th century, there was a shift towards wider access and wider education. And that led to the introduction of labels. But now we're in a new period of thinking about museum inclusion and thinking about whether the labels are doing enough to make people feel welcome, not just physically in the museum, but whether their own voices, their own perspectives, and their own backgrounds are on display, are represented, and are welcomed. So that's the research that underpins Labeling Museum, and we put that into practice with a number of activities designed for some sixth form students to make them think outside the box, to make them think about how museums educate, how they display, what they display, who decides what's displayed. So today we had 4 activities, bringing in different academics from Kiel from a variety of disciplines. People from the School of Medicine, School of Life Sciences, School of Law, and the School of the Humanities, looking at the collections from these different perspectives. We had students from a variety of A-level subjects, and they really were willing to think outside of their own discipline and engage with activities, for instance, creative writing, writing their own poetry, that might feel uncomfortable for someone who's just doing physics A-levels. So they were really willing to go with the activities, but I think they brought a lot of exciting new ideas to it as well. You can tell that this is a generation that is politically engaged, that does care about the issues. And so one of the tasks they were set was redesigning the Natural History Gallery to tell the story of human interventions and climate change. And they were off like a rocket. It was incredible because they care about these issues and they want to see them reflected in their local museums. They want museums to talk to them about the problems facing them today. And oftentimes historical collections look like they don't do that. They look like they talk about the past and not the now.
I think a lot of them went down kind of the more emotional route than we do. We're usually used to displaying natural science collections, particularly historically, in a very factual way. It was really interesting to see how the emotional stories came out of the descriptions and how things like climate change and habitat loss are coming to the forefront of people's minds.
I was really surprised at the level of interest and the level of thinking outside the box they were able to display. So they were able to appreciate what was the strategies that were employed, and they were also able to see why there were different objects on display, how those animals and plants on display were able to interact in that specific environment.
They had just phenomenal ideas about how we could reinterpret the collection, which I thought was really exciting and can be rolled forward into future projects I'd like to do. I'd be really interested in working with museums to do, for instance, an exhibit on the objects that have simply lost their labels. Every museum has things in the stores that they don't know what they are. And I think it would be phenomenal to bring those out for a group of students and say, well, what do you think it is? What do you want to know about this object? How could we find out? So those kinds of activities I think could really be expanded on based on the ideas the students were bouncing off each other today.
We were taking this group of completely made up animals, which is very, very freeing because that means there is instantly no right answer. And we were fitting them into the known, living and extinct tree of life. They would be constrained by the description, but I was really hoping that they'd get something in terms of what do I know, what don't I know, what else is there to be known, but with the evidence from the description itself. They responded really well to any situations in which I would give them new facts or new knowledge or a new suggestion, and they engaged with that really constructively. I think that anything which really encourages students to engage and to bring in knowledge from new fields, to bring in new ways of thinking, new ways of solving the problem, I think that's a really strong solution.
Today we've done a workshop on ivory and jade. Should they be allowed or shouldn't they be allowed? If you think about the ethics of both the way that jade and ivory is being collected, from the hunting of elephants to the miners that suffer from exploitation of their labor force. All of these issues are contemporary but also historical issues that reflect the ethics and the legality of each and every item here in the museum. I divided the students into two groups. One group was advocating for the museum's right to present jade and ivory, and another group was representing a group of activists and professors that signed a petition to ban any presentation of jade and ivory. And I was surprised how seriously the students took the task. They used the very short amount of time that they had very efficiently by building up, constructing arguments from imperialism to ethical arguments to legal arguments, looking at legal documents and journalist reports about ivory and jade. And they surprised me, and so they took much more than I expected. They all have such a rich world of ideas, and I've learned more than them, from the terminologies to their perspectives that I can even use in my own research on law and humanity and ethics. So it was a brilliant experience, really. Yeah.
I wanted to convey to the students how labels can be quite authoritarian when we enter into a museum, and that we behave in particular ways when we enter a museum. I wanted them to think, quite differently about how they might respond to an object, rather than just taking it for granted and thinking somebody else has labelled this and this is its story. I wanted to encourage them to have a diverse range of mediums, through which they might make a label. I found that they were really responsive to that. They were aware that the museum had certain cues where the museum wants you to move in particular ways and respond, in a certain manner to certain objects. Like there's ones that are more grand and ostentatious that want to be seen, and there's objects that are more smaller and out of the way. And the students were really aware of this when they were creating their labels. One really good example was a doodle that one of the students did, and then they scribbled it out and they said, oh, it was terrible. And I thought that was amazing, because imagine a label in a museum with a scribbled out doodle on there that's not really giving you much information. It'd really disrupt that relationship that we've got to objects when we're in museums. Another one was this student. He was quite underconfident with the poem that he produced, and it actually turned out to be a really good piece of work, where he'd used the coloration of the object that he'd found, and he'd used the texture of it to create a stanza of a poem that was quite skilled.
I think the real answer is definitely to rethink labels. Labels don't always strike us as useful. They have sort of basic what is it information, but not a lot else. And I think it would be really helpful to get new voices into the labels. So what does this object mean to someone who used it initially? What was its cultural significance there? What does it mean to someone from that culture looking at it now, today in Stoke? What's that experience like of, for instance, the jade collection? A visitor from Japan or China, what would that mean to them? We could put that perspective on the label. We could put the history of the object, how it came to us on the label. Those imperial colonial practices can be recorded, and that's an important part of the story of the object. It's an important part of acknowledging the way social relations work on a global scale.
I like a short label. I like labels that are quick and easy to process and that allow people to immediately answer what something is.
I find that individual objects are under-labeled, so I often think that I could do with a bit more. For example, the man's skull, it says man's skull. I could do with a little bit more on that. So I really find the history of the object in its original context would be better if available, rather than the history of the object since discovery, or rather than just knowing what it is. I mean, that obviously is the thing I want to know first. That's the headline. But I would like a little bit more in terms of what was it for then.
I see labeling becoming more and more political. They reflect more a wide range of views about the piece, about the history of the piece, about the creator, about the critics. And I think this is a process that is slow, but we should push towards a more diverse way of looking at exhibition items.
It's useful for a lot of the different institutions that were involved. So the students are working on independent research projects that are by nature interdisciplinary. And so the school was really excited about the way this project got them thinking about things from a number of different disciplinary perspectives, and also bridging those and thinking about how they can take this forward in their studies. For the museum, I think it was really important to demonstrate that your local museum with a kind of eclectic collection like the Potteries, which covers local history, natural history, fine art, design, military history, really can offer a unique perspective. That specialized collections, single focus collections, actually limit the way you think about them just by saying this is a natural history museum. Whereas something like the Potteries, I think, could be the future of museums as well, because these kinds of eclectic collections invite new voices. They invite those multiple perspectives, multiple voices that museums are really trying to get in to both their labeling practices and their audience these days. And so I think it's important to show local students that their own local museum is actually really engaged with these questions. It's not stuck in the past. It's really part of a forward push.
I'm sick of looking at bowls. Imagine if the label said that.
And from my perspective, it's really important to get students to feed into the research. So I've distributed survey questions so I can see kind of expectations that people have coming into a museum, but also how we can change it, how we can impact their use of their local organizations. We want them to come to their local museums, we want them to use these collections and to see that they are useful for a wide variety of different topics they might be studying in school or they might be interested in their lives. And that museums can be political, they can be forward-looking, they can be addressing really big problems in society today like the climate crisis, and give new ways of answering old questions. All right, so that was an overview of the project. If you do have any questions about the stuff I've talked about, do feel free to pop them into the chat and we'll sort of address them after Will talks through his collaborations with the Lapworth Museum in Birmingham. So I'm going to hand over to Will now.
Hi, thanks very much. It's nice to be here. Lovely to visit Scotland from the south, and looking forward to at least saying hello to all of you. Yeah, like Julian said, my name's Will, and I am kind of well. I'm going to start with a disclaimer. A lot of what I'm about to tell you kind of comes from a place of privilege, because a lot of the relationships that I've been able to develop with museums have been able to percolate slowly because I've been lucky enough to be in a permanent academic post. So it's not that anything I'm saying is a straightforward recommendation. I think some of these things you would find quite hard to replicate depending on your own circumstances. But what I want to try and do is tell you my story and give you a few kind of ideas for how to think about museum collaboration. I think that's what I really want you to take away from this. To do that effectively, I'm just going to say a word about who I am. So I got a PhD in English from King's in 2012. I work on science fiction, the history of science fiction, broadly speaking, and since 2013 I've worked in various capacities for the University of Birmingham, mostly in the English department, although last year half of my job moved to liberal arts. And what I work on is, at the moment, I'm writing a book about the human history of dinosaurs between 1845 and the present. That's thinking about dinosaurs as both objects of literature and science, the relationship between scientific research and the imagination. So that's what I do, and hopefully that's enough for you to understand why I want to have a relationship with the Lapworth Museum. Here's a secret about the city of Birmingham. It's actually really nice, and one of the reasons for that is the presence of the Lapworth Museum. It's a small geology museum which we have on the campus of the University of Birmingham, right in the middle, in this building that you can see in the bottom right. It's the bottom floor of that building, and the top 2 floors of it are the Earth Sciences department. So it's right there, kind of connected to the research. It's an accredited collection, which is a big deal, and it's an ACE national portfolio organization as well. It's got about 250,000 specimens of all different kinds, mostly from the Midlands, but as you might expect, but from all over the world. And that's a collection that includes about 15,000 minerals. This is John, the museum's director. He would want me to tell you, if you were here, that the Lapworth was nominated for Art Fund Museum of the Year in 2017 and was the only science museum to reach the final. And this is a really big deal for lots of reasons, but the one I want to emphasize is that the Hepworth Wakefield, which won the Art Fund prize that year, has a permanent staff of around 50 people. At the same time, the Lapworth had 4 and a few volunteers. It's a really small outfit. It's a tiny museum, despite the size of the collection. And that means, what it means that they're small, Jordan said a word about this before, is that they really like help, especially when it doesn't cost them much in terms of resource, not just money, right, but time, because they don't have much of it. And it also means that they're sometimes a bit slow with communications, and that's something that Jordan already said a lot about. So that's one thing about the Lapworth, is that they're kind of little. Another thing about them, and another way in which I was lucky to be working with them joining the university in 2013, was that they've changed a lot. So top left here is the oldest known photo of the gallery. From the 1930s. The museum dates back to the 1880s, but this is the oldest photo we have. And the bottom right, you can see it just before it got renovated in 2014. Now, these photos are taken from opposite ends of the same room. And although the perspective's different, it's hopefully enough for you to see that the museum basically doesn't change across the 20th century. It's pretty static, and it's pretty old school, those kind of high Victorian Edwardian cases. It's very much a teaching collection. And although it's technically open to the public, it's not a place that the public felt very welcome. It was actually quite even difficult to find. It didn't have an entrance from the streets. You had to kind of wander through the university building to get to it. So it was a big deal when in 2014 they got a Heritage Lottery Fund grant to redevelop £2.7 million, and they turned it into this. It's a beautiful space, and if you're ever in the Midlands, I do hope you'll drop in once it's safe to do so again. What I really like about this refit is that they've kind of tried to keep the vibe of the older museum. They've kept those original cases whilst also making it modern and accessible. So just one thing I'll pick out for you here. If you look at those wooden cases at the ends, they've put glass in the bottom as well and just filled it with weird stuff from the collection. That's for the kids, right? Because before, the only way a child could see any object in this museum was by standing on a stool or being lifted up. Because again, designed as a teaching collection, right? So this is just one little example of the way in which they kind of tried to transform the space and make it more open and more welcoming. that's the main gallery that you're seeing there. They also built 3 other ones, Active Earth in the top left, which is about volcanoes and earthquakes and things. And the bottom right, you can see the Mineral Wealth Gallery, which is upstairs, has lots of gemstones. There's also a new temporary exhibition space, which I'll say a word about in a moment. So this was a big deal, this renovation, huge for them. It took years, and before COVID, it roughly quadrupled their annual footfall, possibly a little bit more than that actually. But it also meant indirectly that they were doing more work with schools, they were doing more outreach stuff in the community, they were trying to bring different kinds of audiences in. And as it happened, I arrived just as this was kicking off. So it was really lucky for me. And the other way in which it was lucky for me was the untapped potential from a humanities perspective of these collections. So this is the Lapworth Archive. We're behind the scenes at the museum now. This is an absolutely massive archive of all kinds of scientific documents, but it includes all the papers of Charles Lapworth, the museum's founder. It is the most complete collection of any 19th century scientist other than Darwin. It's completely uncatalogued. There are some hand lists. And until I came along, as far as I'm aware, no representative of the humanities had ever been in it. So, you know, the potential there is absolutely vast and was absolutely vast and is absolutely vast. The other thing in terms of, other than kind of raw material, the other kind of potential there was in this growing recognition that the museum was having, that there was an arts and humanities angle on their galleries that they hadn't really thought about. And so that is where I came in. And again, I want to keep emphasizing this. It's blind luck that I joined the museum, just the university, just as its museum was starting to have these thoughts. Okay, so what did we do? The first thing I want to say is that I am not going to tell you in this talk everything that we have done, as there isn't time for that. So I'm just going to take you through a few examples that I picked up basically because I think they represent kind of different ends of the kind of spectrum of what you might do with a museum. As Jordan said earlier, you know, if you think collaborating with a museum, you're probably thinking about an exhibition, and so we did do one of those. So I'll talk about that first. This is drawing out the dinosaurs. This ran 2018. It's something that I came up with in collaboration with the paleontologist Richard Butler, who was the academic keeper of the museum at that time, and with Jordan as well, actually, who was really, really helpful in putting this together. I'm showing you there a wall. This is the idea of kind of the idea of this exhibition was to kind of talk about how art is already in natural history museums, including the Lapworth, but we don't normally think of it as art. So we took these pictures of dinosaurs and stuck them in frames that were appropriate to the time that those images were created, and started to try and give people a sense of how dinosaur images changed over time. This is just a little bit of the exhibition. It wasn't a very big exhibition, and the things I want to stress about doing this or two things really. One, it was incredibly hard work. The big exhibition is probably the size of a large bedroom. It took months and months and months, and it's among the hardest I've ever worked. Only a few marking seasons have really taxed me more, and running an international conference. It was a lot of work. And I'm glad I did it. I don't regret it, but I am going to think very carefully before I agree to do another one. That is kind of where it left me. And this is the second thing I wanted to say, really. I want to emphasize that this kind of exhibition, this kind of outlay of effort is not the only way of collaborating with a museum. This isn't the first thing I did with the Lapworth, and it wasn't the last either. So here's another thing that happened that was kind of different. I was approached by John, and it was that way round, which I think is worth mentioning, because he had agreed to run a one-dayer for scientists on, the subject was the geology of Mordor. And that's a reference to the fact that in Lord of the Rings, Birmingham is like and the Black Country is supposedly a model for Mordor, the nasty part of the world where all the industrialization is and everybody hates it. And again, with my Birmingham champions hat on, I feel a need to point out that many of the nice locations in the Lord of the Rings are also supposedly inspired by parts of Birmingham. What they wanted to do was they wanted someone at the end of the day to actually talk about the Mordor thing. So I said, well, you know, that's not really what I do, but I'll come along. I gave a 20-minute talk. One thing led to another, and it ended up with me giving a keynote at the Earth Science Teachers Association when the Lapworth hosted it in September of 2019. That is still the only time I've ever been invited to keynote a conference, and it was a bunch of secondary school geology teachers, one of whom went to sleep in the front row 5 minutes in. So it was a chastening time for me, but it was a nice 40 minutes because I got to talk to them about fantasy maps and about geology and fantasy fiction, and I made them do some close reading as well, which was very satisfying from a disciplinary perspective. It led to a few other talks that I did after that, and I'll say a little bit more about this later, but I think one thing I want to emphasize is this isn't my research specialty, or wasn't at that time, but it's something I've done a lot with since, and it's been quite useful for me in all sorts of ways. So that's another kind of collaboration that I did with them. Here's the Lapworth Lates. So Jordan already mentioned this thing about demographics going to museums. It's easy to get school age people in, and it's easy to get interested retirees in, and there's a kind of gap in the middle. Lots of museums have responded to this, or responded to this before the crisis, by putting on these lates, and the Lapworth was no exception. So they started programming a lot of these events. Actually, I was less involved with these, and that's sort of the point. They're kind of realizing at this stage that these things are important, and they sort of they had got to the stage where it's not about me bugging them anymore. They're kind of reaching out and doing these things for themselves. I'm not claiming sole responsibility for their involvement in lates, by the way, but I think it was talking to people like me that made them realize that this was something they could do. So I did sit on the selection committee where we chose the artists who were going to work at the lates. And so there were kind of dance displays like the one you can see here. There were stalls with activities, there were food things, there were videos showing craft stands, all kinds of stuff. And they've run a few different nights with different themes since. And the other way in which I was directly involved, this was a career highlight. I got to be Grand Marshal of a dinosaur parade, a parade of people wearing dinosaur costumes that they had made out of scrap cardboard that evening. I was a Nyctosaurus, rather nice kind of charismatic pterosaur. Anyway, so they've done all sorts of evening events in the museums now, and most recently they did a screening of Jurassic Park with deck chairs in the museum space and popcorn and everything. And that, I think, was the last public event I went to. It was in February of 2020. So that's the lates. This is kind of at the other end of the spectrum. I applied in 2017 and was lucky enough to get an AHRC Leadership Fellowship called Narrativizing Dinosaurs. This was a £215,000 grant, which brought a postdoc into the archive space to do some work on that. And it also bought me some time to start working on a book about dinosaurs. That kind of the Lapworth was an intrinsic part of this application. At that time, the AHRC was very, very focused on impact. It needed to be very impacty indeed to get anywhere. And I'm absolutely convinced that without my pre-existing relationship with the Lapworth Museum, that application would not have been successful. But there's a kind of coda to that story, because the museum makes applications too. So very recently, they have successfully applied for a grant from the National Archives on the Archives Unlocked scheme. And this is something that will fund an archivist to come into that archive that I showed you at the beginning and try to begin making sense of it. It's a grant that I think the Lapworth only realized they had the potential to apply for after working with me and my postdoc on the Narrativizing Dinosaurs project. And we both were able to do a bit of the preliminary work to make that grant successful. So I'm really pleased that that's been good. And that person will come in post in September and hopefully open that archive to the humanities as well as to scientists in whole new ways. Okay, so I think that those are the things about the Lapworth that I kind of want to tell you, and I just want to use the last few minutes of this talk, and probably about 5 minutes left, to just kind of reflect a little bit on what I got out of it. I'll start there. I think you have to be slightly mercenary about these things, so I'm going to start by being slightly mercenary. And I want to emphasize the range of what I think I've got out of this. So firstly, publications, not just by me, have happened in consequence of all of this. Jordan and I co-wrote something which has a few pages on the Drawing Out the Dinosaurs exhibition that I mentioned before. My postdoc wrote a piece about the refit of the museum, and of course, when I eventually write this stupid book, which has been delayed many times now, the Lapworth will be shot right through it, because my work with them has been so formative for me intellectually. So things are getting published. Bureaucratic capital is the other thing I'm getting out of it. So it's useful for my career to be able to argue that I've worked with museums in this way, and particularly I was able to contribute to an impact case study that my college was writing about collaborative work with natural history museums more broadly. Now that is probably the least fulfilling piece of work I've ever done, but if there are redundancy consultations, I will write on my form that I was on that impact case study, and I'm sure it will help. So it gets you a cachet that helps, even when it's unpleasant. Funding potential, I think, is something I spoke to on the last couple of slides. And the thing I want to emphasize there is it's not just funding for me, right? I created a job for someone else for a year with it. And there's this new archivist coming in, so that's another 18-month post. And there is also, as Jordan mentioned, the future funding potential. So the museum application that Jordan and I are working on at the moment doesn't involve the Lapworth directly, but the experience that we both have of working with the Lapworth is going to be absolutely instrumental in arguing to the funders that that's something that's worth supporting. Much more important than any of those three things is the warm glow that you get out of it. And I'm not being sarcastic about that. It really is wonderful to kind of have a peripheral involvement with this really small team, to watch them transforming, to feel a small amount of responsibility for a part of that change, and to find myself in a really different kind of intellectual community that is so different from the place where I teach and research that's 4 minutes walk away from it. So it's really good for me from that perspective. But I think it's really important not just to think about what I got out of it. The museum gets stuff out of it too. Jordan again spoke about this a little bit before. So one of the big things for museums is they want to be able to demonstrate the relevance of their collections across audiences, and that's different kinds of academic audiences, not just different publics, especially university museums. So it's been really useful for the Lapworth, which wrote its own impact case study, to say that people like me have been using the archives, because then they can position themselves as an institution that is helpful to English literature academics, to historians and so forth, to art historians increasingly, as well as to the people you'd expect, the geologists, the paleontologists, the earth scientists. So it's really useful for them to be able to say that. And I think it's also really useful for them to see the surprising potential of what they've got. I think there are some objects and documents that they sort of thought of as curios, and they didn't necessarily understand the potential of them in terms of engagement and even in improving knowledge. So the museum gets those two things, and it gets everything on the previous slide, because everything that helped me also helps them. Those publications are things that they can mention in support of their own funding. The bureaucratic capital is something that that also works for them. And the funding potential, as I've already said with the archives grant, is something that they have access to as well. And the warm glow, I think they get it as well. I think they find me a little bit strange, but I think that they like the sidelight that I shine on what they do, and I think they get something out of our meetings together and my membership of their community. I hope they do. This is my last slide now. I was really happy to be given a chance to reflect on what I've learned by my kind of semi-accidental series of collaborations with the Lapworth. The first, I want to underline something again that Jordan said before. Absolutely nothing happens quickly. These are busy people. Truth takes time. And if something's worth doing, it's worth doing properly, and it can't be rushed. You've got to grow these things. The second big thing I've learned, I think, is that collaboration takes many forms. I was expecting, if you'd asked me, I suppose, primarily scholarly benefits. But a lot of the collaboration that I've done has been administrative or logistical or behind the scenes stuff, things like consulting on which artists to hire, reading their job applications for them, reading funding proposals for them, things like that. pedagogical collaboration, I haven't really mentioned this, but we've had students of different kinds in the museum space, and that's been really useful, undergraduates and postgraduates. And even artistic collaboration is possible. And that's been really interesting to learn. I think this is the thing I would perhaps really want to emphasize. Collaboration means being changed as well as affecting change. So relatively few of the things I've done kind of directly come out of research that I have been doing. Some of them do, but it's much more about being open to the vibe, I think, to learning what helps them, and then to thinking about how that might re-inflect itself into my scholarship. So I mentioned that Tolkien talk. And that's really changed how I position my expertise and the kinds of papers I'm writing. So that's been really useful. Serendipity is your friend. If you had, if I had gone to John in 2013 and said, okay, I want to do this exhibition, I want you to start a program of lates, we're going to do these publications and these funding applications. It doesn't happen like that. I'm able to narrate it like that now in hindsight. It's all very impressive now. But what it actually is just keeping your ears open for opportunities and following them as they arise, being alive to the possibilities of things. That's where I want to leave it, I think. So thank you very, very much for your attention. I'm going to stop sharing and hand you back over to Jordan.
Thank you so much, Will. That was fantastic, and I think gives a wonderful overview of the different kinds of collaboration that are out there. And I think Will has highlighted just the variety of activities that you really could do, particularly with time. So of course, you've got a time limit on what you're doing right now as a doctoral student, but think about any project you're doing at the moment as kind of a potential seed for something you could do later on. You can always kind of come back to these things and keep those relationships alive with institutions. So we are just at the hour mark. We're going to stop recording now because that's the chatty info bit. We're going to take a sort of, let's say, 7-minute comfort break. I'm sure we could all use a bit of stretch of the legs and a cup of tea. So let's come back at 11:07 and we're going to start on the more hands-on part of this workshop. So I will see you back at 11:07.